Elijah Noah, who I'm talking about, my brother, and during his senior year of high school, he went in, applied for 2 colleges, one in Scotland, and he decided that he was going to go to school in Scotland. And then Wheaton College in Chicago, he was on a waiting list, and he thought, oh, forget it. I'm just going to go ahead and go to Scotland. And then it just happened one day, he went to a gas station, and he lost his credit card. So he went back to church, because he was just there, and he looked, and he met a lady, and that lady asked Noah, how's your college search going? And inside, Noah thought, oh, I'm deciding to go to Scotland. But for some reason, he told her, oh, I'm on the waiting list at Wheaton. And that woman decided to call Wheaton herself. So she called and she talked to him. She told him that Noah is this amazing guy. You should let him in. And as it happened, Noah ended up getting accepted into Wheaton. And Noah realized that, wow, God had put him in that spot at that time for this to happen, and that he wanted him to go to Wheaton. And when Noah got to Wheaton, he was the only deaf person there amongst all these hearing people, and it was very lonely. Now, that time Noah needed strong faith, strong obedience to God, to have gone to a place and been the only deaf person, because he felt that God called him to go there. I couldn't have that kind of faith. I couldn't be alone with no language and communication. And another cool story about faith and obedience is we know that I think it was 10 years ago, God showed up to Elijah in his dream and told Elijah, you will be the same size as Jacob. And all along, Elijah has had strong faith that he would become tall. Elijah, keep your faith. Keep your obedience to God. Keep doing your stretches. It may happen. No, I'm just kidding. We praise Elijah. He's a wonderful guy. We love our voice interpreter. Even if he got the looks and not the height. He just said he got the looks and not the height. Anyways. But really, Noah's faith is rare. To have that faith in that kind of situation. To have God call him into this strange, scary environment. Now, we know the story in the Bible about Abraham. When he was asked to sacrifice his son Isaac. I'm sure we all know that story, and people tend to go, wow, that story just shows what strong faith Abraham had, and what strong obedience to be willing to sacrifice his son Isaac. It's the best story of faith and obedience there is. Well, all right, so let's read this. We've got three scriptures with this I want to go through. So sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham. And he replied, here I am. Then God said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. Early the next morning, Abraham got up, saddled his donkey, and he took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. Early the next morning? Seems like Abraham was excited. Wasn't that he was anxious all night? He slept, he got up, he was excited, ready to go. And I was just puzzled about this. Now, let me ask you, how many of you praise Abraham for his faith? How many of you think that he was stupid and foolish to be willing to sacrifice his son. Some of you think that? Okay. Well, my opinion, I'll share later, but really, Abraham needed to have faith in that situation. Because God promised God promised Abraham that his son Isaac would have multitudes of children, would grow the kingdom of Israel. And at this time, Abraham was 85 years old. So Abraham listened to God's promise, had his son, and now when he's 90 years old, he's an old man, he finally had a son, and he thought to himself, he didn't have a son. He thought to himself, he decided he was going to sleep with his wife's servants. And the Bible says that Abraham rejected her, and that's a whole other story. It was not a good situation. It was a terrible situation. But God said that the servant would not bear children for him. So when he got to be 99 years old, God again told him that next year you will have a son, and that son will grow your kingdom. So finally, when Abraham was 100 years old, Isaac was born. And it was his one and only son that was supposed to become the greatest nation. And you know Abraham had to have been a worried dad and very attentive to Isaac. And anytime Isaac got hurt, he must have panicked. Like when Isaac would say, "Dad, can I go play football?" You know he'd say, "No, if you get tackled and hurt, and no, you have to stay here." Dad, do you mind if I go play marbles? No, marbles are hard. They can hit you in the head and you can get blind. And no. You know he was overprotective. He kept a watchful eye on him. That's his only son who's supposed to grow this big nation. Then God told Abraham to sacrifice this son. Let's skip ahead. Let's take a look at verse 2 here. That says, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, and the Jews wonder why God said, not just your son, but then he says, your only son. It's like these guys are talking with each other. Take your son, and Abraham responded, I don't have two sons. And God told him, your only son. And Abraham said, oh, well, which son? Well, Isaac. Oh, that son, okay. Now why? Why did God tell him to sacrifice Isaac? So God was testing Abraham? Why would he test him? Because he was so focused on worshiping Isaac rather than worshiping God, maybe? Jews and Christians both, for many years, have been puzzled and don't understand why God decided to tell Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. And there's lots of different theories out there about this chapter. One interesting theory says that we tend to think of Isaac as being young, right? As a baby, a little kid. But theologians think that at that time Isaac was 37 years old. And maybe Isaac was willing to go and be sacrificed. So let's look at this next verse. This one says, Isaac actually had asked Abraham where the animals for the sacrifice were, and Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the two of them went on together. The Jewish language does not have punctuation like commas and stuff, where you see a comma, my son. So Abraham basically said, God will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, which will be my son. So you know that at that time, Isaac knew that he was going to be the offering and what God's plans were. So that's one theory. That Abraham didn't necessarily sacrifice his son, but that Isaac was willing to be sacrificed. Another theory says that Isaac really died and later resurrected. And the reason I think this, because let's look at this next verse. Verse 19. At the end of the story, Abraham willingly put Isaac up for sacrifice. But at the right time, an angel stopped his hand and said, "You've been faithful and obeyed God in all situations. And now instead of sacrificing Isaac, you can sacrifice a ram." The next part of the story says that Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off together for Beersheba. And Abraham stayed in Beersheba. Well, where's Isaac? Wouldn't Isaac come back too? This just says Abraham. So people read this and think, well, maybe Isaac really did die, and he showed up later resurrected. People are trying so hard, the point of this, people are trying so hard to understand what's really happening in this story. And there's a philosopher with a big fancy name that says either Abraham knew God would not permit him to sacrifice Isaac, or he knew that if he really did sacrifice Isaac, that God would provide another way for his kingdom to grow into a great nation. That's an interesting thought. Now, I think that story of Abraham shows that sometimes we have to suspend our disbelief. Or we have to have a suspension of disbelief. Which means that sometimes God calls us to do something, but we don't always understand how we can be able to do that. So Abraham sacrificing his only son, but at the same time, God had promised him that his kingdom would grow to a great nation. Now it's a conflict. How is that going to work? Sometimes in our life, situations come up that seem impossible, like Noah going to Wheaton, knowing that God called him to Wheaton, but he was the only deaf person there in his hearing community. That's a situation for him that seemed impossible. At that time, we have to have a leap of faith. We have to go ahead and jump forward and do it. My opinion about this story is I think that Abraham did not do a good job, because I think that we know that God would never tell us to sacrifice our sons. That Abraham, God would never permit him to sacrifice his son. And I think that Abraham could have known that God was going to stop him. And maybe that's what happened. Maybe Abraham already knew what the outcome was going to be. But in the situations where we feel like God is telling us to do something that seems impossible, you have to have a leap of faith. One big example is our church. 2 years ago, it came time for us to leave. At that time, we didn't know where we were going to worship. We didn't have this building. We didn't know where we were going to go. We had no money. We didn't know how we were going to pay for pastors or how we were going to pay rent. But we knew that God called us to leave. We knew that God told us to stay together. And now, 2 years later, we're still here. There's a lot of new churches that crumble and fail. But we took a leap of faith. We knew we had to be on our own, and we trusted God, and we're still here. So out of curiosity, how many of you in life situations has God made promises to you, but it seems impossible? I know the Bible tells us, it promises us joy in life. But we know that many times joy might seem impossible. We struggle with families. Some families have divorce. Some families have kids that have a really tough time, that seem impossible, that joy seems impossible. Some of our life situations keep going, and we know we need to take a leap of faith and trust that God will help us. God will always have work in our hands. I know many of us have been fired or laid off and are searching for work, but God still promises to have something to do to keep us busy. Sometimes it seems impossible, especially now with our economy. It's hard to find the right job. But we have that promise if we take a leap of faith. We have a general promise of salvation. A salvation from all of our pain, suffering, sadness. And sometimes that seems impossible. How could God save us from this world? But we can have faith that it will happen. Maybe you have a specific situation. I don't know what may be going on in your life. Maybe you're starting a new job. Maybe God has called you to meet someone new, a new friend, a new life path. Maybe down the road you can tell me these situations that popped up and how God has called you to do something, and that something seems impossible because of your life situations and maybe conflicts you have. But know that God can help. 2 weeks ago in my sermon, we talked about that sometimes we fail at things. Sometimes we're called to do something new, try something, and it fails, but we know at that time that we fail that we're still there. And it doesn't matter where we fail or we're successful, we take a leap of faith and we know that God will help us. No matter what, or no matter how difficult the situation may be. Amen? Let's close with prayer. God, we thank you for being able to come together today as a church family. We thank you that we're still here, that you're